Afternoon, folks. Hope everybody is doing well today. This is going to be my first lesson on animal anatomy and physiology, general principles thereof. If you are in my biology class and are following along, you might want to go on YouTube, grab a copy of my notes for this section so that you can get some important terminology and spellings for you along the way. Now, obviously, when we're talking about animal anatomy and physiology, this is a pretty broad heading, given that we're discussing organisms ranging from the simplicity of a sponge to the complexity of a vertebrate animal. Now, a couple of basic terms first. Anatomy, you already know this word, I'm sure. Anatomy refers to the structure of an organism's body, the actual physical structure. Anatomy can be envisioned is either what we call gross anatomy, that is visible to the naked eye. We could talk about surface anatomy, that is external structures as opposed to internal anatomy. We can talk about histology, Histology, which is sometimes called microscopic anatomy, that is the anatomy of tissues. Or we could even talk about cellular anatomy or molecular anatomy, sometimes called the ultrastructure of the organism. Now, physiology, when you hear the term physiology, that refers to the functions of organisms. So anatomy is structure, physiology is function. Anatomy will tell you about the parts of a kidney. Physiology will tell you how that kidney filters your blood to produce urine. Now, you are already accustomed to using both of these toolkits in biology as a means of evaluating evolutionary relationships. We can group organisms together into shared relationship groups on the basis largely of shared anatomical and physiological traits. You inherit common features from common ancestors. We call that homology. And you all know by now that organisms can exhibit both anatomical and physiological homology. That is, similar structures inherited from a common ancestor and similar functions inherited from a common ancestor. This is why, for example, it's possible for us to use animal models for testing human drugs, because most mammals work basically the same way that we do. Now, even though we are covering a very, very broad range of things when we talk about animal anatomy and physiology, all animals, regardless of their body plan, regardless of their habitats, have certain common problems they need to solve. All animals need to find a way of obtaining oxygen, and in fairly high amounts, given that all animals engage in aerobic respiration. This becomes more crucial for motile rather than sessile animals. All animals need mechanisms in order to obtain nourishment. Animals are heterotrophs. They have to find a way to take in and process food from their environments. All animals need a way of circulating vital nutrients and gases throughout their bodies, getting some way of delivering those substances to the tissues that require them. All animals need a way of taking away metabolites, that is, various waste products that are secreted by the body. All animals need to protect themselves both from environmental danger and from other animals. All animals need to be able to heal and repair damage, whether that is inflicted by disease or injury. All animals need hereditary mechanisms for passing their DNA on to the next generation, and in almost all cases, that means sexual mechanisms. So, obviously, the specific needs of various environments are not the same for everything. If I am a deep sea tube worm, I need adaptations for dealing with high pressure that a seagull does not. If I am a flying animal, like a seagull, I need adaptations for bearing my body aloft in the air that a land-based mammal does not. But all animals do have certain common adaptive problems they have to solve, mostly in getting the resources the body requires, removing the wastes, ensuring that all the tissues get what they need, and in reproduction. Together, looking at the anatomy and physiology of animals can tell us a lot about how the organism adapts to its environments. I can see certain body plans and say that organism is aquatic, or that organism flies, or this organism is well suited for climbing, or this organism is well suited for running. Details of body plan like this tell us a tremendous amount about the animal's lifestyle and adaptations, even if we have not gotten to observe a live specimen. I can take a look at the skeleton of a dinosaur and I can tell you whether it's a plant eater or a meat eater, for example, just by looking at its teeth. Ultimately, every body plan is the result of the cumulative effects of natural selection over many generations. Calling it a plan is a misnomer, because animal anatomy and physiology is a series basically of slapdash adaptations to whatever challenges the environment happened to be posing at that particular point in time. And we are the end consequence of that. Now, some of the effects of this cumulative adaptation over time is that after a while, parts go away and cease to be useful. Sometimes they go away completely. You don't have a tail anymore. Actually, no, that's a bad example. You have a vestigial tail, you have a tailbone. You don't have gills anymore. That's a part that went away completely, although we see evidence of our gill slits during our embryonic developments. So what I want to talk about in this chapter is taking a look at some general details of animal anatomy and physiology, the things that are shared in common across the animal kingdom, and then a little bit at some specific details of particular animal groups that are useful for illustrating things. I will fall back, as Aristotle did, on our own kind, Homo sapiens, as a baseline for comparison. We are, after all, more familiar with ourselves than anything else, so when I need to illustrate functions, I will a lot of times refer to those functions in humans, unless there's a better organism for comparison for a given thing. Now, it should be understood that in terms of putting together your body plan, animals are limited by a few factors. One of those is quite simply the raw materials of preceding generations. You have to build on what's already there. When organisms are adapting, they cannot radically reorganize their body plans. Just because the environment has suddenly changed by a massive meteor strike and it's much colder and darker does not mean that in a single generation I'm going to be able to adapt to come up with a whole suite of darkness-adapted lenses for my eyes and cold-adapted metabolism for keeping my body warm and all that sort of thing. I got to work with the existing structure. This is why the organism that survived the KT event were the ones that were already kind of well suited to those circumstances. We are always building on what came before. I am a tetrapod. I'm a four-limbed animal, and developing a set of wings out of my back would not be an anatomically feasible development without some pretty radical mutations, because a wing is another set of limbs. Think about it. Birds and bats, they have arms. Their arm is their wing. They don't really have any kind of other limb. They're a tetrapod like you. So if I wanted to make a Pegasus, my winged horse, slapping a couple of wings on the back of a horse is not quite that simple, because somehow I have to flip a lot of very basic developmental switches to, first off, develop a third set of limbs. And then secondly, to maneuver that set of limbs away from the ground and into a more useful feature, and then and only then to start thinking about how are we going to build a wing out of this thing. Is it serving an adapted need even? So we are fundamentally limited by the chassis that we have already built, by the structures and functions that have already evolved. In some cases, an organism, particularly if it is highly specialized, is not going to readily adapt to a novel environment very well. And that is why you will find that specialist animals often do very poorly in a changing world. Now let's think also in terms of basic constraints of physics. I could put wings on the back of my horse. It does not make a horse aerodynamic. If I'm a flying animal, I need things like light, hollow bones, so I have less mass to hold aloft in the air. I need a streamlined body that air can readily flow around. I need a wing-like structure that can catch the air and give me lift to push back against the drag of gravity. If I am a fish or a dolphin or a shark, I need a tapered, smooth body that can easily cut through the water column to get speed. And I need fins oriented in such a way that I can stabilize my body movements as I go and not go into a rotating spiral, or be able to control my forward movement or to change my direction. If I am living on land, I need adaptations to not becoming desiccated in the atmosphere. I need adaptations to being able to breathe in air rather than water. I need adaptations to holding my own weight against gravity. If I'm the aquatic animal, I need adaptations to being surrounded by water 24/7 without my cells becoming hyperosmotic and exploding, hypoosmotic, excuse me. I also need adaptations to extracting oxygen from a much less oxygen-rich environment than an atmosphere. If I'm in a desert, I need to be able to resist heat. I need to be able to resist dryness. I need to have a body plan that's well suited for that. So you're going to find that the basic needs of the physical demands of the environment are going to end up being the primary drivers of the kind of body plan that works or does not work. Now, I'm just talking about external adaptations to the environment. Let's talk about internal adaptations. Common problems all animals need to solve. I have to get nutrients and gases to every cell in my multicellular body. That means I either need a relatively thin, flat body where essentially every surface is a diffusion membrane, like you get in a jelly, for example, or I need a thicker body with some kind of network of internal ducts or passages to move around fluids and gases, like a circulatory system, for example. The more complex my body is, the more things I have to worry about. I'm a motile animal. Well, I need structures to generate mechanical resistance from my muscles to act upon, like a skeleton or a hydroskeleton. I need musculature in the first place. I need much more intensive energy production to power movements. All these things lead to a much more complex body plan. And the more adaptations I have to my environment, the more things I can do, the more complex my body plan is going to have to be to support all of this. And that's everything from external coverings to protect me against heat and radiation and water, to internal digestive tubes capable of absorbing nutrients and getting them where they need to go. So that's kind of an overarching consideration. But let's start zeroing in a little bit more closely. Remember back when you took your Bio 1 class, you thought about the hierarchy of life, the organization of living systems from the simplest to the most complex parts, right? So, simplest, we got atoms. Everything alive or non-alive is made out of atoms. Atoms join together to make molecules. Molecules come together to make much more complex structures that we call macromolecules, like our proteins and our carbs and so forth. And you put together a bunch of macromolecules in the right arrangements, and you get a cell. Now, for a single-celled organism like a protist or a bacterium, a cell is enough. That cell is the highest level of complexity that you achieve. How about for a multicellular animal? In most animals, in fact, in all animals with the exception of sponges, we are going to have a body plan in which those cells are organized into tissues. We talked about embryonic tissues previously, the ectoderm, endoderm, and mesoderm that all organisms have in their developmental stages. But if you're not a sponge, those cellular layers, those primary germ layers, are going to begin to differentiate, and they're going to become other kinds of tissues. Now, there's a great diversity of tissues in your body. We define a tissue as a group of two or more kinds of cells with a common set of structures and functions that arise from the same region of the embryo. That's a tissue. Tissues allow cells to do things they couldn't do individually. Group cells together, and you can get emergent properties. You can get qualities from two kinds of cell working together that neither of them could achieve individually. Put together different kinds of tissues, of course, and you get organs. An organ is any structure that is, by definition, composed of two or more tissue types. Put together organs in groups, and you get organ systems, which can carry out related collections of tasks. But let's build up to that, right? Let's start with the most basic component. Let's talk about the tissues themselves. Now, there are a great many kinds of tissues in your body. But all animals have to, again, excepting sponges. Sponges are the weirdos in almost everything metabolically and anatomically. Sponges lack true tissues. They're the only animals that do. But in all of the 34 to 35 other phyla of animals presently living, we're going to have a variety of different tissue types. But they can all be lumped into four broad categories. There are four basic types of animal tissue. And I'll put them up front here, then we'll talk about them individually. You have epithelial tissues, EPITHELIAL. We have connective tissues. We have muscular tissues. And we have nervous tissues. Those are the four basic categories of animal tissue. Animals are unique in that we have something like muscular and nervous tissue. There are things that are analogous to your epithelial or connective tissues in plants and fungi. There are coverings and so forth, and binding structures, but there is nothing like muscular or nervous tissue in any other form of life. But let's start with our most basic ones. When you are looking at me right now, most of what you are seeing is epithelial tissue, because epithelial tissue makes up the coverings and linings of animal bodies. Epithelial tissues consist of sheets of tightly packed cells. Cells are squeezed very close together. Epithelial tissues have very little by way of extracellular material. By the way, there's a term I'm going to use a lot here when you're talking about tissues. We're going to talk about extracellular matrix quite commonly. The term extracellular, outside of the cell. The extracellular matrix is the non-cellular parts of your body, anything outside of the cells. It primarily consists of fibers, mostly protein fibers, and fluids. So the extracellular matrix could be your extracellular fluid or your extracellular fibers or some combination of the two. Epithelial tissue has very little matrix. There are not a lot of spaces between the cells. They are squeezed tightly together, not a lot of gaps between them. Any matrix that's present is microscopic, and therefore very little extracellular fiber or fluid. Epithelial tissues are arranged in flat sheets. The upper surface of an epithelial tissue is called its apical surface, A-P-I-C-A-L. So this is the apical surface of my skin. The bottom of an epithelial tissue, the base of it, is called the basal surface. Sorry, brain just froze for a second there. B-A-S-A-L, basal surface, apical surface. The basal surface of the epithelium is usually anchored to what we call a basement membrane. The basement membrane brings in the nutrient supply for the epithelium and carries away its wastes. It is worth pointing out that most epithelial tissues do not have blood vessels in them. They do not have nerves in them. All of their sensation and all of their nutrition and oxygen comes in through the basement membrane from blood vessels and nervous structures located beneath the epithelium. Very few blood vessels or nerves in epithelial tissue itself. Epithelial tissues, again, make up coverings and linings. They form the outer coverings of organs and structures. They form the linings of spaces and cavities in the body. By the way, a term you might hear me use from time to time, the term lumen, L-U-M-E-N. A lumen is the space inside of a bodily structure. So we can talk about the lumen of your stomach or the lumen of an artery or what have you. Now, you will find that epithelia have three basic functions. Epithelial tissues serve a function, first off, of protection. They are the primary barriers. They protect the structures that they are covering. Protection against desiccation. Your skin prevents your body from losing too much moisture. Protection against heat and cold. A lot of epithelial tissues give rise to structures like fur that help you to stay warm. You've got protection against radiation. UV rays from the environment have to get through many layers of skin before they get to anything deeper. There's a reason skin cancer is the most common kind of cancer. Protection from toxic environmental chemicals, and protection simply from physical harm. Your skin is the foremost barrier that everything from bacteria to enemy organisms that are attacking you confront. So protection is a very basic epithelial function. Secondly, epithelial tissues function in secretion. They secrete a lot of different things. Most of your glands are made primarily of epithelial tissues. Your skin secretes sweat. You've got a lot of different things secreted by epithelial tissues. Many epithelia form secretory membranes. There are two basic kinds of membranes in your body. You have mucous membranes and serous membranes, both primarily made from epithelium. A mucous membrane, and spell that M-C-O-U-S, Mucus, spelled O-U-S, is the adjective describing a kind of membrane. Mucus, spelled M-U-C-U-S, without the O in there, is the sticky substance that it produces. So a mucus, O-U-S, membrane secretes mucus, U-S, the sticky fluid. Mucous membranes protect the openings to body orifices. You'll find mucous membranes in your oral cavity, in your nasal cavity, in your anal canal, in your urinary tract, and in the vaginal canal. Then you have serous membranes, S-E-R-O-U-S. Serous membranes are lubricating membranes. Mucous membranes use sticky mucus to trap particles coming into the body from outside. Your mucous membranes take advantage of mucus in order to collect foreign particles, trap bacteria, trap dust, that sort of thing, and keep them from doing harm to you. Serous membranes are lubricating membranes. They secrete serous fluids, which are lubricating fluids. For example, your lungs are lined with a serous membrane that has a moist fluid that prevents them from drying out with the air that they inhale, and also prevents the air sacs of the lungs from sticking together. Most of your internal body cavities, like the inner wall of your chest cavity, are lined with serous membranes. Now, you will find that we classify epithelial cells. Oh yeah, one last function. We've got protection. We have secretion, secreting everything from mucus to serous fluids to sweat to glandular secretions. Most of your body's glands are primarily made of epithelial tissue. And finally, we have absorption. Your body has to absorb a lot of stuff. Your lungs have to absorb oxygen. Your intestines have to absorb nutrients from your food. So a lot of epithelial tissues have an absorption function in which they absorb gases or nutrients brought into your body. Now, we classify epithelial tissues in two ways. We classify them by the shape of the cells in them and by the number of layers of cells they have. I said that epithelial tissues consist of sheets of flat cells, or flat sheets of cells, I should say. They might have one sheet of cells, or they might have multiple layers stacked one on the other. I have simple epithelial tissues, often called simple epithelium for short. Simple epithelia is the plural of epithelium. Simple epithelia have a single layer of cells. They're one cell layer thick. They are very thin. They make good absorption membranes. We can talk about simple cuboidal epithelium. Simple cuboidal epithelium consists of a single layer of squarish or rounded off cells. You'll find simple cuboidal epithelium in, among other places, the gonads, the reproductive organs, where they produce eggs and sperm. You will find simple squamous epithelium, S-Q-U-A-M-O-U-S. If you don't know that word, squamous means flat. Simple squamous epithelium consists of a single layer of very flat, thin cells. They are the thinnest membranes in the body. You'll find simple squamous epithelia in the linings of your lungs, the alveoli, the air sacs of the lungs, to absorb oxygen. You'll also find them in the linings of your digestive tract to absorb nutrients. We will have simple columnar epithelium. Columnar, C-O-L-U-M-N-A-R. Columnar means column-shaped. The cells are tall and narrow, kind of like pillars. Simple columnar epithelia often secrete mucus. They frequently contain cells called goblet cells, G-O-B-L-E-T, which have a little pocket in their surface for storing mucus. They are also often ciliated. The upper surface of simple columnar epithelia often have cilia, small hair-like fibers on the cells, to push mucus coats over their surfaces. You're going to find simple columnar epithelia in the lining of the anal canal. You're going to find them in the lining of the vaginal canal, a few other places in the body. And finally, we have pseudostratified epithelium. This is my favorite because when you teach biology, you have things like your favorite epithelial tissue. Pseudostratified epithelium, P-S-E-U-D-O, stratified, all one word. Pseudostratified means false stratification. They look like stratified epithelia, but in reality, it's a single layer of cells of different heights. So every cell touches the basement membrane, not every cell reaches the apical surface. And as a result, the cells look like they're at different heights, and it gives the appearance that there's more than one layer of cells. Like columnar epithelia, they're often ciliated with goblet cells. You'll find pseudostratified epithelia in your upper respiratory tract, forming the linings of your nasal passages and your throat, for example. They're very good at moving mucus coats out of your respiratory tract with the cilia and pushing them down into your stomach, where they get broken down and digested, and that removes any bacteria or other particles trapped within them. So those are our simple epithelia. Stratified epithelia are going to consist of 2 or more cell layers stacked on top of each other. Most of them are going to be the same, just different shapes. Different names. Okay. Same shapes of the cells that we talked about before. So we're going to have a stratified cuboidal epithelium. Stratified cuboidal epithelium consists of multiple layers of squarish or rounded cells. You're going to find stratified cuboidal epithelium in a lot of your body's glands, glandular secretions. Stratified columnar epithelium is the least abundant of these in your body. Stratified columnar epithelium basically happens in places where 2 simple columnar epithelia are pushed together. We find it in limited areas of the male reproductive tract and urethra. We have stratified squamous epithelium, multiple layers of relatively flat cells stacked on top of each other. Stratified squamous epithelium is the most common epithelial tissue in your body. It forms the lining of your oral cavity, forms the lining of portions of your throat, but most importantly, it forms the outer surface of your skin. The surface of your skin is a keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Keratinized, K-E-R-A-T-I-N-I-Z-E-D. Keratinized means that the cells are packed with keratin, K-E-R-A-T-I-N. It's the same protein found in your hair and your nails. Keratinization makes your skin waterproof. So stratified squamous epithelium makes up the outer layer of our skin. It's upwards of 30 to 50 cell layers thick, and everything about 6 or more cell layers up is dead cells. Cells that are so removed from the nutrients at the base of the epithelium that they've died, and they've gotten flatter and more filled up with keratin the further up they go. That layer of dead cells is important because that means you have a barrier that is touching the environment all around you that bacteria and harmful forces have to get through. A bunch of dead cells that doesn't matter if they get damaged because they're already dead. I can rake my hands along my arm there. I don't know if you can see in the camera. I just drew some lines on my arm with my nails. I felt the pressure of it, but it didn't really hurt. It's because those cells are all dead. And finally, we have transitional epithelium. Transitional epithelium is limited to the bladder and the urethra. It's interesting because it's 5 to 6 cell layers thick, mostly cuboidal or rounded cells, whenever it's relaxed. But when it stretches, they compress down into 2 to 3 cell layers. Therefore, transitional epithelium is highly elastic. It's good for the bladder to expand to accommodate urine. It's also good for the urethra to expand to accommodate the flow of urine. And yes, I have mentioned more than one type of epithelial tissue in several different parts of the body. Depends on where you look, what you will find, like where you will find these different things. The lining of the vaginal canal is mostly a non-keratinized, moist stratified squamous epithelium, but get deeper into the female reproductive tract and you find simple cuboidal epithelium. All right, so those are your epithelial tissues. How about some connective tissues? Connective tissues are interesting. They're the most diverse kind of animal tissue. Connective tissues get their name because they join up parts of the body. The key feature of connective tissue is that it has more matrix than cells. That is, there's more extracellular fiber and fluid than there is cellular material. So you're going to find abundant fibers, abundant fluids. Depending on what kind of fibers and fluids you've got, your tissue might have a springy consistency. It might have a very loose, soft consistency. It might be rubbery. It might even be stone-like. Or it might be a liquid. Now, your kinds of fibers that you will find. The protein fibers found in connective tissue are quite important because they are the primary factor that binds together the cells of animal bodies. Extracellular fibers are a big factor in what your body is holding itself together with because we don't have cell walls to cement our cells together the way fungi and plants do. So we rely on extracellular protein fiber for that. Pardon me, a little bit of hiccups here. So, we've got three basic kinds of fibers found in our connective tissues. We have collagenous fibers, collagenous, made out of collagen. You've all heard of collagen, collagen. Collagen is the most common protein in your body. 3/4 of all your body's protein is collagen. Collagen fibers make up the basis of cartilage, bone, and skin, and they're found all throughout your body, binding things together. We also have elastic fibers. They are made primarily of a protein called elastin, elastin. Elastic fibers have the ability to stretch out and spring back to their previous shape. They're quite important in certain organs that have to do that regularly, like the lungs and the hearts. You'll also find them in your skin, because your skin has to be able to stretch and go back to the way it was before. Finally, we have reticular fibers, reticular. When anything is reticulated, that means that it's mesh-like or net-like. Reticular fibers primarily form supportive frameworks, or stroma, stroma, around certain glands and organs in the body, like the spleen and the lymph nodes. Now, in terms of our types of connective tissue, we've got a few different varieties of connective tissue. We can sort connective tissues into fibrous connective tissue, cartilaginous connective tissue, fluid connective tissue, or bony connective tissue. Easiest one, bony connective tissue. There's only one type of bony connective tissue, and that is osseous tissue, osseous, or what you know better as bone. Osseous tissue is unique to vertebrates. No other animals have it. Osseous tissue is going to consist of a collagen framework that has been hardened and mineralized by the accumulation of calcium and phosphate minerals. Bony tissue is vital for the structure of our skeletons, provides mechanical leverage for movement, protects soft organs like the brain, acts as your body's primary mineral storage reservoir, and also inside of bones you carry out hemopoiesis, the formation of blood in your bone marrow. So the skeleton's got a bunch of different functions. We also have our fluid connective tissue. Fluid connective tissue is an easy one as well. In fluid connective tissue, the matrix is liquid rather than fibrous. Our fluid connective tissue, of course, is what you know better as blood. Blood is a connective tissue. It's got more matrix than it does cells, and it has 2 or more kinds of cells, so it is a tissue. The matrix of blood is a clear to yellowish fluid called plasma. Plasma contains the various circulating nutrients that move around in your body, as well as a wide range of plasma proteins, such as the antibodies that help you to fight viruses. The rest of blood, the cellular part of blood, the formed elements as we call it, consists of red and white blood cells mostly, as well as cell fragments called platelets. When we talk about animal circulation, we're going to talk more about blood as a tissue, but it is a kind of tissue. Fluid connective tissue is primarily involved in gas and nutrient exchange, moving around the nutrients absorbed by your food, moving around oxygen and carbon dioxide, collecting metabolic waste products from throughout your body and sending them to the kidneys for removal. All of these are functions of blood. Also moving around hormones, transferring heat, transferring immune cells to places they need to go. Blood has a wide range of functions too. Now we have our fibrous connective tissues. Fibrous connective tissues, as you can probably guess from the name, contain abundant and conspicuous fibers, and that's F-I-B-R-O-U-S, fibrous. We can divide our fibrous connective tissues into dense and loose fibrous connective tissues. In dense fibrous connective tissues, the fibers are packed closely together. There's not a lot of space between them, and the cells are tucked in between them. Dense fibrous connective tissues can be either dense regular connective tissue or dense irregular connective tissue. In dense regular connective tissue, the fibers are arranged in an orderly fashion. That is, they're parallel to one another, either straight or in wavy lines, cells tucked in tightly between them. Dense fibrous connective tissues primarily are found in your tendons and your ligaments. Dense regular connective tissues are primarily found in your tendons and your ligaments because their regular structure lets them transfer force effectively. By the way, if you don't know, the difference between a tendon and a ligament is that a tendon, T-E-N-D-O-N, attaches muscle to bone. A ligament, L-I-G-A-M-E-N-T, attaches a bone to another bone. Dense, irregular connective tissues have the protein fibers arranged in disorderly fashion. They're kind of arranged at random. That makes them tougher and more able to resist random tearing. You'll find dense, irregular connective tissues forming protective capsules on the outside of a lot of structures in our bodies. A lot of organs are surrounded by a capsule of dense, irregular connective tissue, like the kidneys, for example. You're going to find dense, irregular connective tissues in the deepest layer of your skin, the dermis, to make your skin tear resistant. When those do get torn, by the way, they form highly visible scars on the surface of the skin that we call stretch marks. Stretch marks basically indicate tearing of the fibers in dense, irregular connective tissue. Dense connective tissue, by the way, has almost no room for blood vessels, and therefore it heals very slowly and very poorly. All of you who have been athletes or followed an athlete know very well how dangerous tearing a critical tendon or ligament can be to your athletic career, because those injuries heal very poorly, if they heal at all, without surgical intervention. Now, so that's our dense connective tissues: dense regular, dense irregular. Then we have our loose connective tissues. Loose connective tissues have a much looser arrangement of the fibers. They have a lot more fluid in their matrix. They are typically very rich in blood, highly vascularized. Three kinds of loose connective tissue. We have our areolar tissue. Areolar tissue, A-R-E-O-L-A-R. Areolar tissue is going to be what we often think of as the fascia, F-A-S-C-I-A. This is the loose, thin, fibrous network of tissues right underneath your skin, binding skin to bone, binding organs to each other. Areolar tissue is highly vascularized, rich blood supply. It's right underneath your skin to provide nourishment to the skin. You'll find areolar tissue anchoring most epithelial tissues. If you look underneath most epithelial tissues, right under the basement membrane, you'll find areolar tissue binding the epithelium in place and giving it its rich blood supply. Areolar tissue is also quite rich in white blood cells to defend the body against harm should that tissue be punctured. So anytime bacteria get through your skin, first thing they have to confront is all of the defenses found in your areolar tissue right beneath it. We also have adipose tissue, A-D-I-P-O-S-E. Adipose tissue is fatty tissue. It contains lots of adipocytes, A-D-I-P-O-C-Y-T-E-S, fat cells, cells that are mostly filled up with triglycerides. Fatty tissue has a bunch of functions in the animal body. It serves as an energy reserve, first and foremost. Fat is your body's long-term energy storage. Acts to cushion and protect numerous organs. Your heart, for example, is surrounded by a cushion of fatty tissue. Your eyeballs are held in place in their sockets by cushions of fatty tissue. Got little tiny fat pads in your fingertips to help cushion against rubbing on things. You got bigger fat pads in your backside to prevent your pelvic bones from grinding on things whenever you sit. You also have small pads of fat in joints to act as shock absorbers. And you have a layer of fat beneath your skin, so-called subcutaneous fats, which helps to act as thermal insulation. You know how little kids have those cute chubby faces? Their bodies are smaller. They have a thicker layer of subcutaneous fat, the baby fat we call it, to protect them against heat loss. And finally, when we're talking about our loose connective tissues, let's talk about reticular tissue. Reticular tissue, as you probably gather from the name, is formed primarily from reticular fibers. That's going to be found mainly around, again, certain organs, forming the stroma around the lymph and the spleen, so the lymph nodes and the spleen, and protecting them from harm. Then we have, last but not least, let's talk about cartilaginous connective tissues, C-A-R-T-I-L-A-G-E-N-O-U-S, cartilaginous. Cartilaginous connective tissues, as you can probably guess, are made primarily of cartilage. C-A-R-T-I-L-A-G-E. Cartilage is a very important connective tissue in your body, found in several different places. Three basic kinds of cartilaginous connective tissue. We have hyaline cartilage, H-Y-A-L-I-N-E. Hyaline cartilage makes up the gristle on the ends of bones. You ever eat a chicken, or a piece of chicken, you find that little gristly cap on the end of the bone. That's the hyaline cartilage. Forms the caps on your end of your long bones, prevents them from rubbing on each other whenever your joints are in motion. Hyaline cartilage also binds your ribs to your sternum and allows the flexibility of the chest cavity when you breathe. Hyaline cartilage also makes up the flexible tip of your nose. We also have fibrocartilage, F-I-B-R-O, cartilage. Fibrocartilage, sometimes called fibrous cartilage, makes up dense, rough pads of cartilage found in a few places in the body. You'll find pads of fibrocartilage between your vertebrae, making up your intervertebral discs. You'll also find fibrocartilage binding together certain joints in the body. For example, the pubic symphysis, S-Y-M-P-H-E-S-I-S. That's the joint where your pelvic bones join together right above the genitalia. That is held together by fibrocartilage. And finally, we have elastic cartilage. As you can probably guess from the name, very rich in elastic fibers, allows it to spring back into its previous shape, primarily found right here in your ears, giving them their high elasticity, which in animals that have more control of the muscles of the ears than we do, lets them adjust their ear to different positions in order to hear sounds at different angles. Okay, those are our connective tissues. The most abundant tissues in your body are connective tissues, the most variable. Now we have muscular tissue. This one is unique to you as an animal. Muscular tissue is quite a remarkable tissue. It is highly extensible. Muscular cells can stretch much higher than any other cells without rupturing. It is highly elastic, springs back to its previous shape after stretching. Muscular tissue is also highly conductive, very sensitive to electrical signals. Muscular tissue is also highly excitable, meaning it's able to generate an electrical current. Muscular tissue uses electrical currents to stimulate its defining property, contractility, C-O-N-T-R-A-C-T-I-L-I-T-Y, contractility, which is the ability of the muscle to contract. When you stimulate muscle with an electrical signal, it contracts. The fibers shorten, and that allows the muscle to pull on whatever it is attached to. Muscular tissue generates movement in animals. It's responsible for both conscious and unconscious animal movement. In most animals, it is the most abundant tissue by mass. You have more mass of muscular tissue than any other type, even if you have more kinds of and wider distribution of connective tissue. There are three basic kinds of muscular tissue found in animals. We have skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle gets its name because in vertebrates, it binds on to the skeleton. In invertebrates, there's still skeletal muscle. We call it that even though they don't have a skeleton. Skeletal muscle is organized in alternating red and white bands if you look at it under the microscope. So it is striated, S-T-R-I-A-T-E-D. Sorry, I got lost in the spelling for a second there. Striated means striped or banded. Skeletal muscle is voluntary muscle. It is the muscle that you have conscious control over. It's responsible for all of your voluntary bodily movements. When you choose to move your arm or move your jaw or take a deep breath or whatever, skeletal muscle is active. It's pulling on bones to make that movement happen. Also handles unconscious muscular reflexes, such as, for example, the way your knee kicks whenever your doctor taps it with a little hammer, or when you reflexively jerk your hand back from a hot stove. Now, that's skeletal muscle. There's also smooth muscle. Smooth muscle gets its name because it does not have a striated appearance under the microscope. It appears nice and smooth. Smooth muscle is sometimes called visceral muscle, V-I-S-C-E-R-A-L. Anything that's visceral has to do with your organs or your internal organs. Visceral muscle or smooth muscle is responsible for all of the unconscious movements of your bodily organs, the churning of your stomach, the movements of your intestines to pass along digested material, the constriction and widening of your blood vessels to make adjustments to your blood pressure, the hairs standing on end when you're cold or frightened. All of these reflex muscular actions that you have no conscious control over are the result of smooth muscle. And last but not least, we have a very specialized kind of muscle called cardiac muscle, C-A-R-D-I-A-C. Cardiac muscle is exclusively found in the hearts of animals. Cardiac muscle is striated like skeletal muscle, but it's got a different arrangement of the fibers and has some special adaptations to make sure that it never becomes fatigued, because your heart has to keep contracting and relaxing in a continuous cycle for your entire life. And whenever we talk about animal circulatory systems, we're going to go into a bit more detail about exactly how cardiac muscle does that thing. That, like skeletal muscle, is involuntary. Smooth muscle. Smooth muscle and cardiac muscle are involuntary. You have no conscious control over them. Skeletal muscle is the only voluntary one. It's the only one you can choose to control. And last but not least, we have our fourth category of tissue, which is nervous tissue. Nervous tissue, N-E-R-V-O-U-S, is pretty much uniform throughout the body. I don't have different kinds of nervous tissue. Nervous tissue shares some properties in common with muscular tissue in that it is excitable and it is conductive. Nervous tissue consists of cells that are highly sensitive to electrical stimulus, more so than any other cells in the body. The purpose of nervous tissue is twofold. One, to convert sensory stimulus into electrical signals and move those around. Actually, threefold. Secondly, to process those signals and interpret what the data means. And thirdly, to issue commands to the body, send electrical signals to the muscles to carry out responses. So your nervous tissue is basically the communication tissue of the body. It is responsible for all the electrical signaling that allows us to have sensory input to the brain and motor output from the brain. So we take in sensory data with nervous tissue, we process it with nervous tissue, we issue commands with nervous tissue. Those are the three basic functions of your nervous system. Nervous tissue is primarily concentrated in the brain, spinal cord, and nerves, but some amount of nervous tissue is present in virtually every organ of your body. All right, those are our basic types of animal tissues. So that is going to be, I think, a good place to leave this lesson off. Next time we get together, we are going to talk about animal organs and organ systems a little bit, and then we're going to talk about some animal bioenergetics. We're going to talk about the flow of energy through the bodies of animals, which will get us into some things about what it means to be warm-blooded versus cold-blooded. All right? Hope everybody has enjoyed. Thank you for your attention to all of this. And by the way, if any of you have had an anatomy and physiology class before, a lot of this probably sounded familiar to you, because frankly, the basic tissues work the same in all animal groups. We talk about them most commonly in a human context, but all these things I said about where we find, pseudostratified epithelium in you, or where we find, cartilaginous connective tissues in you, they apply to every other animal that has those kinds of tissues. It's worth pointing out, not every animal has all these kinds of tissue. If you're a vertebrate, you have bony tissue, but if you're an invertebrate, you don't. Bony tissue is not part of your body. If you're an animal that lacks a muscular heart, like a jellyfish, you don't have cardiac muscle tissue. So not every single one of these tissues is universally present in every animal, but these are still the basic animal tissue types. All right, now you might be thinking to yourself, all right, so muscular, connective, epithelial, nervous, what's my liver made out of? And that brings us to the next part of all of this, that namely, you put together two or more kinds of tissues, and you will begin to get what we call organs. And that, I think, is where we're going to begin our next lesson. Hope you've all had a good day, folks. Talk to you later.